The Ghost Who Stayed Part 1. The day they buried her twice, the clock on the wall of operating room 3 read 2:47 in the afternoon when Arthur Hendricks began to die. It happened quietly at first, the way serious things often do. A slight dip in the numbers on the monitor, a change in the rhythm of the machine that had been breathing steadily beside him for the past 40 minutes. The attending nurse noticed it first and called out in a voice that was professionally calm, but carried underneath it the kind of alarm that cannot be faked. The resident standing nearest the door stepped back instead of forward. The surgical technician on the far side of the table looked at the monitors, then at the door as though someone more qualified might walk through it at any moment. No one moved toward the patient. Arthur Hendricks, 74 years old, former United States Army sergeant, veteran of Desert Storm, lay on that table with his chest open and his heart stuttering towards silence, while the people trained to save him stood in the paralysis that comes not from fear of failure, but from fear of doing something without being told to. There was a protocol for this moment. There was always a protocol. The protocol required a senior surgeon present. It required written authorization for any procedure beyond the scope of the current operation. It required documentation sign off a chain of approval that moved upward through the hospital hierarchy like a request filed in triplicate. The protocol had been written by people who had never stood in a room watching a man's heart give out while the paperwork caught up. The door opened. She was not tall. Standing at 5'4" in surgical scrubs, a size too large, with dark hair pulled back under a cap, and eyes that moved across the room in a single sweep that took in everything at once, she did not look like someone about to make a decision that would change her life. She looked like a fourth-year resident who had been awake too long and had stopped apologizing for it. Dr. Maya Sinclair crossed the room in 7 steps. She did not ask for a briefing. She did not ask who had authorized what or whether senior staff had been notified. She looked at Arthur Hendricks for 4 seconds, her gaze moving from his face to the monitor, to his chest, to the hands of the people standing around him doing nothing, and something in her expression shifted. Not into panic, not into doubt, into the focused clarity of someone who has been in worse rooms than this one and knows what the next 11 minutes require. She held out her hand. Thoracotomy tray. No one moved. She said it again, and this time something underneath the words made the surgical technician cross the room without deciding to. The tray arrived. Maya snapped on gloves with the efficiency of muscle memory so deep it had become invisible, and she went to work. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not something the people in that room would fully be able to describe afterward. They would try. In the hallway conversations and break room discussions that followed for weeks, they would reach for words and find them insufficient. What they could agree on was this: her hands did not shake. Her voice when she spoke was level. She called for instruments before anyone realized she would need them. She made decisions in the space between heartbeats, and every decision was correct. And when Arthur Hendricks's heart resumed its rhythm under her hands, the sound of the monitor changing was so sudden and so certain that 2 of the nurses in the room actually startled. Maya stepped back. She stripped one glove and checked his pulse with 2 fingers against his wrist, the old way, the way you check when you do not entirely trust the machines. Then she stood still for a moment, breathing evenly, looking at the man on the table with an expression that was not pride and was not relief, but something quieter than either. The door opened again. Dr. Gerald Hartwell was 55 years old and had been chief of surgery at Meridian General Hospital in San Diego for 12 years. He was 6'2" and carried himself with the authority of a man who had spent decades being right in rooms full of people who needed him to be right. His hair was silver and his jaw was set, and his eyes, when they found Maya across that operating room, held something several degrees colder than professional disapproval. He looked at Arthur Hendricks. He looked at the monitors showing stable vitals. He looked at the tray of instruments and at the blood on Maya's glove and at the resident who had retreated to the corner and was studying the floor. He looked at Maya. "My office," he said. "Now." She followed him out. The door swung closed behind them. On the table, Arthur Hendricks breathed. What makes a person stand their ground when every rule says to walk away? What happens when the institution built to protect people becomes the weapon used against them? These are not simple questions. They do not have clean answers. But sometimes a single afternoon will force them into the open, and everyone who witnesses what follows will spend the rest of their lives knowing exactly what kind of person they were in that moment. This is one of those afternoons. 14 hours before Maya Sinclair held out her hand for that thoracotomy tray, she was sitting in the fluorescent quiet of Meridian General's overnight ward, eating a container of yogurt that had technically expired 2 days ago, and reading a chart she had already read 3 times. The night shift at a large hospital has its own rhythm. Emergencies still come, they always come, but between them there are long stretches of a stillness that feels less like peace and more like the held breath before something happens. Maya had worked enough night shifts to stop fighting that feeling. She kept her coffee nearby and her pen moving, and she watched the ward the way she watched everything steadily, with her back to the wall. She had chosen the chair at the nursing station specifically because it faced the corridor. 14 months at Meridian General, and she had never once sat with her back to a door. Dana Mercer had noticed it early on. "You always sit facing out," Dana had said one night, nodding at the position. "Habit," Maya had said. "From what? Training." Dana had the intelligence to hear what that answer did not contain, and she had moved on. She was that kind of person, sharp enough to know when she was not going to get the rest of a sentence and secure enough not to require it. Dana Mercer was 36 years old and had been a trauma nurse at Meridian General for 8 years. The hospital ran on people like her, competent without arrogance, observant without cruelty, loyal, in the way that comes from watching people at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. She had been among the first people at Meridian General to treat Maya with genuine warmth, and she was one of the very few whose company Maya actively sought out. At 11:30 that night, Dana had appeared at the nursing station with 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Maya without being invited, which was the arrangement they had arrived at over 14 months of overnight shifts. "Room 412 came back from imaging," Dana said. "They want to know if you've reviewed his scans. An hour ago, his family has been called. How are you holding up?" It was the kind of question Dana asked regularly in a tone that made clear she wanted the real answer. Maya had needed time to get used to that. "I'm fine. You've been in since 6 this morning." "I know." Dana looked at her over the rim of her cup. "There's a word for people who work 20-hour shifts voluntarily." "Efficient," Maya said. "I was thinking of something else." Maya smiled and it reached her eyes, which was not always the case. Dana noticed, and something in her expression settled into something warmer. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Dana said, "The old soldier in 307 was asking about you." Maya's attention shifted from the chart in a way that was small but not invisible. "What did he say?" "He asked if the young doctor was coming back. I told him you'd stop by on rounds." Dana paused. "Sweet man. No family listed in his intake forms." "I'll check on him." She finished her coffee and walked down the corridor to room 307, and that was the beginning of the part of this story that is harder to explain. Arthur Hendricks was awake. He was sitting up against his pillows at a slight angle, the way men of a certain generation sit when they do not want to appear to be lying in bed, and he was looking at the window, which showed nothing but the reflected light of the room against the dark outside. On the small table beside him, next to a glass of water and a paperback Western he had apparently given up on, sat a Bronze Star medal in a worn leather case half open the way you might leave a photograph where you can see it. He turned when Maya came in, his face deeply lined and carrying the weathering of a man who had spent significant parts of his life outdoors in hard conditions arranged itself into something warmer than neutral. "Thought you might have gone home," he said. "Not until 7. She checked his chart. "How's the pain? Manageable?" He watched her with the attentiveness of a man accustomed to reading people quickly. "You're the one who was in here when I came around this morning." "That's right. You move fast." Maya looked up from the chart. "When they brought me in," Arthur said, "I wasn't all the way under yet. I saw you. You moved differently from the others." Differently how? He considered this with the care of someone choosing words deliberately, like someone who's worked in a hurry before, not panicked, quick in a way that's become ordinary. Maya set the chart down and looked at him. He was watching her with clear dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to know what they were looking at. "You were in the service," she said. It was not a question. 22 years, Army, made sergeant, 2 tours, Panama, then the Gulf. He glanced at the medal case. 1991, Desert Storm. We were outside Kuwait City when our convoy took fire. He paused. Lost 2 men that day. Almost lost 3 more. He looked at his hands on the blanket. The medic who worked on the 3rd one, she was something to watch. Didn't look old enough to be where she was, but you forgot that about 30 seconds in. He looked up. Reminded me of you, actually. The ward was very still around them. "What was her name?" Maya asked. Arthur shook his head slowly. "Never got it. She was gone before I could ask. That happened a lot over there. People appeared when you needed them and disappeared when you didn't." He looked at the Bronze Star. "I've thought about her over the years, whether she made it home." Maya looked at the medal. "She probably made it home," she said. Arthur studied her for a long moment, hearing more in those 4 words than they technically contained. He did not push. He had lived long enough to know that some answers come on their own schedule or not at all. You move like the medics I knew in the Gulf, he said finally. The good ones. They never asked permission either. Maya smiled brief private, directed somewhere beyond the room. Get some sleep, she said. I'll be back for morning rounds. She walked out of room 307 and down the corridor, and in her jacket pocket among the ordinary objects of a working physician was a photograph. Not the original. She had destroyed the original 4 years ago on a cold morning in a parking lot in Virginia as instructed. This was a copy she had made from memory, drawn by hand of a group of people standing in front of a military transport in a flat and dusty landscape. Her face in the original had been third from the left. In the drawing she carried, that face was covered by a small, deliberate rectangle. Old habit, old discipline, the kind that does not leave even when you wish it would. The day shift arrived at 6:55, and Maya did what she always did at the end of a long night, completed her charts, checked on the patients who had concerned her most, and drank bad coffee at the break room window, looking out at the parking lot where the morning light was doing what morning light does to ordinary things, making them look briefly like they might mean something. She was not thinking about what was going to happen next. She was thinking about Arthur Hendricks, about the bronze star on the table beside his paperback Western, about a woman who had appeared in a desert outside Kuwait City in 1991 and saved a man's life and disappeared before he could learn her name. She was thinking that there are people in the world whose entire lives run beneath the surface of the recorded world, present and necessary and unacknowledged, and that this is sometimes a choice and sometimes a sentence, and it is not always easy to tell the difference. Her pager went off at 2:43 that afternoon. Cardiac event room 307, all available personnel. She was already moving before she finished reading. What happened in those 11 minutes has already been described. What happened in the 12 seconds between Hartwell's voice and the door closing behind them in the corridor has not. As Maya walked past the other residents and nurses and technicians, not one of them met her eyes. This was not cruelty. It was the calculation of people who understood what was happening and had made their peace with it. The hospital hierarchy was not a metaphor. It was a structure with real consequences, and Gerald Hartwell had spent 12 years ensuring that everyone inside it understood exactly how real. Only Dana Mercer watched Maya go. Dana's hands were carefully at her sides. She watched the door until it closed, and then she looked at Arthur Hendricks on the table and at the monitors showing his steady heartbeat, and something moved across her face that lived in the territory between grief and anger, without being quite either. Hartwell's office was on the fourth-floor corner, facing with windows looking out over two directions of the city. The diplomas on the wall were large and numerous. The desk was wide and dark and uncluttered. The bookshelves held medical texts organized by year of publication, and a photograph of Gerald Hartwell shaking hands with a man Maya did not recognize at an event she had not attended. He did not invite her to sit. He stood behind the desk with his hands flat on the surface and spoke in the measured tone of a man who has prepared for this conversation, which told Maya immediately that this was not a conversation that had started this afternoon. You performed an unauthorized thoracotomy, he said, without supervision, without written approval, without following the established procedure for emergency surgical intervention. Mr. Hendricks was in cardiac tamponade. There was no time. There is always time to follow procedure. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Maya looked at him. There is always time. Hartwell repeated, his voice quieter now, which made it worse, to follow the protocol this institution has put in place to protect its patients, its staff, and its legal standing. What you did in that room was not medicine. It was improvisation, the kind of reckless, unilateral decision-making that gets people killed. It kept him alive. That is not the point. With respect, Maya said, and there was something in her voice now. Not anger, something steadier than anger, something that had been pressed down for 14 months and was no longer entirely willing to stay there. I think it is exactly the point. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. His jaw was tight, and in his expression, behind the professional disapproval, behind the administrative authority, there was something Maya had been trying to name since her first week at Meridian General. Not the irritation of a department head with a difficult resident, something more deliberate than that. Something that had always seemed to know her in a way she could not account for. You're terminated, he said, effective immediately. Clear your locker and surrender your badge to security. I will be recommending a formal review of your conduct to the medical board. Maya looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, understood. She turned and walked out of his office, and she did not slam the door because she was not the kind of person who slammed doors, and because slamming it would have given him something she had decided not to give him. The walk from Hartwell's office to the main corridor took approximately 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, word had already spread. Hospitals communicate faster than people outside them ever appreciate. The building breathes as one organism, and when something significant happens to one part of it, the rest of the body knows within minutes. By the time Maya stepped out of the elevator, the corridor had already rearranged itself into the configuration of people who know something has happened and are waiting to see how it presents. Some of them looked away. Some of them studied the floor. One of them, a second-year resident named Elliot Graves, 26 years old, 3 months into his first hospital posting, looked directly at Maya with genuine distress and took a half step forward as though he might say something. The person beside him put a hand briefly on his arm. He stopped. Maya walked. She walked the way she always walked, evenly, without wasted movement, eyes reading the space around her without appearing to. She walked through the avoidance and the whispers and the pointed non-acknowledgement of people she had worked beside for over a year, and she kept walking until she reached her locker and collected what was hers: the spare scrub top, the energy bars, the paperback she had been meaning to finish for 3 months, and last of all, from the inner shelf, a small framed photograph of a dog she had owned briefly and loved completely, and lost in circumstances she did not think about anymore. She closed the locker. She walked to the front desk and laid her badge on the counter. The administrator on duty was a woman named Rosemary, who had worked the desk for 11 years and who had always struck Maya as refreshingly indifferent to hospital politics. Rosemary looked at the badge, then at Maya, and was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, hun," she said. "Thank you," Maya said. She walked out through the main entrance into the October afternoon. The doors slid closed behind her. She stood in the parking lot in her scrubs with her small bag and the particular stillness that falls over a person when the thing they have been quietly dreading finally arrives and turns out to be exactly as real as they feared. Hartwell had followed her out. This was not something Maya had anticipated. He had come not alone, but with a small assembled audience, 3 attending physicians, the hospital's administrative director, a cluster of residents who had followed the way. People follow when a public accounting is about to happen. He stood on the steps of the main entrance with the parking lot spreading before him like a stage and spoke in his carrying voice, the one he used for department meetings, the one that expected attention and received it. "I want everyone here to understand what happened this afternoon," he said. Maya turned around. She stood in the middle of the parking lot and looked at him without moving. "Dr. Sinclair violated the core protocols of this institution. She performed unauthorized surgery without supervision, without approval, without regard for the procedures that exist to protect every person in this building. This kind of decision-making is not medicine. It is ego, and it has no place here." The assembled group listened. Most of them said nothing, which is what most people do when someone with authority says something they are not entirely sure they believe, but are not prepared to contest. Elliot Graves was at the back. He raised his hand. "Dr. Hartwell." Hartwell turned the full weight of his attention to the second-year resident. "Mr. Hendricks is alive," Elliot said. His voice was steady, which cost him something. "Isn't that what we're supposed to be working toward?" The silence that followed was brief and instructive. "Mr. Graves," Hartwell said, "you are 3 months into your residency. When you have spent 12 years building the standards that allow this hospital to function, you may offer opinions on how those standards should be applied. Until then, I suggest you listen and learn from this." Elliot stepped back. The audience absorbed this. Maya watched all of it from the parking lot with her bag in her hand. From a distance, she might have looked like someone simply waiting for a ride. From closer, if you knew what you were looking for, you might have noticed that she was reading the situation with the attentiveness of someone who does not stop assessing simply because the immediate emergency is over. That her weight was balanced, her eyes steady, her breathing, even in the way that even breathing is a discipline rather than a default. You might have noticed that she was not watching Hartwell. She was watching everything else. Dana Mercer had come through the side entrance and was moving along the edge of the parking lot toward Maya with the careful casualness of someone who does not want to draw attention to where she is going. She reached Maya and stopped beside her and looked straight ahead at Hartwell's still speaking figure. "You saved his life," Dana said quietly. "I know," Maya said. "The whole ward knows it. That won't change what he's saying." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet." Maya looked at the bag. "I need to think." Dana reached out and quickly put her hand on Maya's arm. "For what it's worth," she said, "what I saw in that room today, the speed, the precision. I've been a trauma nurse for 8 years. I've never seen anyone work like that." She paused. "Where did you actually learn to do that?" The question had been asked before. It would always be asked in one form or another. Maya had a version of an answer that was truthful in its components, if not its architecture. Training, she said. Lots of different places. Dana looked at her with the expression of someone who has heard that answer before and understands exactly what it does and does not contain. Okay, she said, and then lower, be careful. Maya nodded and walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and her hands on the wheel. For 90 seconds, she let herself feel what she had been too busy to feel since 2:47 that afternoon. 4 years, not of hiding exactly that word, implied something shameful, and she was not certain shame was the right word for a calculated survival. 4 years of subtraction, of removing the parts of herself that did not fit the civilian frame the way you strip equipment before a border crossing. The posture she had softened, the reactions she had slowed down, the answers she had learned to give that were true in their components and false in their architecture. She had been good at it. That was what she was sitting with now in the parking lot in the October afternoon light. She had been genuinely, consistently good at being less than she was. And she was tired of it in a way that had nothing to do with today and everything to do with the 4 years that had led here. She thought about Arthur Hendricks in room 307, about the bronze star on the table beside his paperback Western, about a woman who had appeared in a desert in 1991, saved a man's life, and disappeared before anyone could learn her name. She wondered if that woman had also at some point sat in a parking lot and felt the particular exhaustion of a life lived beneath its own surface. The window on the passenger side darkened. Dana had followed her. She was standing outside the car with the expression of someone who has important information and has not yet decided how to deliver it. Maya rolled down the window. Hartwell went back inside about 2 minutes after you got in the car, Dana said. He made a phone call. He went to the far end of the corridor, away from the nursing station. She hesitated. He looked scared, Maya, not angry. Scared. She held up her phone. On the screen was a photograph, slightly blurred, taken from distance. Hartwell standing with his back partially turned, one hand flat against the wall, as though he needed support. I took it on instinct. I don't know if it means anything. Maya looked at the photograph. Hartwell's body language was nothing like the commanding posture he had held on the steps 20 minutes ago. The set of his shoulders was the set of a man reporting in rather than presiding. Did you hear any of it? Maya asked. The word she and something that might have been ship. Dana paused. And a name, I only caught part of it. Voss. She spelled it. Does that mean anything to you? Maya's face did not change, but her hands resting on the steering wheel tightened very slightly, and Dana, who noticed things, saw it. It doesn't mean anything, Maya said. Thank you for telling me. Dana looked at her for a moment longer. Okay, she said in the tone that meant she did not entirely believe what she had just been told, but was choosing to respect it. She stepped back from the car. Take care of yourself. Maya watched her go. Then she sat alone in the car in the quiet and said one word very softly to no one. The name Dana had spelled out. She said it the way you say the name of something you buried and waited and hoped would stay down. It had not stayed down. She became aware of the sound gradually, the way you become aware of something that has been building while your attention was elsewhere. It was coming from not from the west where the medevac helicopters sometimes came in over the water, but from the south and growing. A heavy rhythmic percussion, not the sound of the civilian aircraft that served this hospital, and not any police helicopters she had heard over this part of the city. It was the sound of a military specification rotorcraft operating at a power setting she could identify without choosing, to the way you identify the voice of someone you have known in circumstances that leave a permanent mark. She got out of the car. Above the roofline of Meridian General, against the flat blue of the October sky, the silhouette appeared an MH-60 Seahawk in United States Navy gray, without civilian markings, moving with the purposefulness of an aircraft that is not sightseeing. It circled once. It descended toward the rooftop helipad. Around her, people had stopped. Patients at windows. Staff who had come outside for the spectacle of the afternoon, now looking up. Security guards reaching for radios with uncertain hands. The suspended quality of a crowd that has witnessed too many unusual things in one afternoon and is waiting to see what the universe intends to add. The helicopter touched down with the clean, precise contact of a crew that practices landings the way other people practice breathing. The side door opened. The man who stepped out was in United States Navy dress uniform and moved across the helipad with the unhurried stride of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room he enters. He was perhaps 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cut dark hair, going silver at the temples. He reached the rooftop door, stopped a security guard with a single raised hand, said something that resulted in the guard stepping immediately aside and disappeared into the building. 2 minutes later, he appeared through the main entrance. He stopped on the steps and looked across the parking lot with the scanning attentiveness of someone running a rapid assessment. His eyes stopped. He walked towards her car. Maya stood beside the Civic and watched him come. His bearing was Navy and officer, and something more than either the unhurried authority of a man who had walked into difficult rooms and expected to walk out of them. His eyes found her without apparent effort, which meant he had either been given a description or had been told exactly where to look. He stopped in front of her. "Dr. Sinclair," he said. His voice was calibrated to carry even at conversational volume. "Commander," she said. A fractional pause in which something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had not expected her to identify his rank on sight. "Commander Nathan Cole, United States Navy." He said it without breaking pace. "I have a pilot down on the USS Abraham Lincoln 50 miles offshore. Severe chest trauma, suspected cardiac tamponade. I need your assistance." Maya looked at him steadily. "I was terminated approximately 1 hour ago." "I'm aware. You still came. That's why I'm here." Hartwell had appeared at the top of the main entrance steps. He had seen Cole and was moving across the parking lot with the stride of a man who had not had enough confrontations today. "Commander," Hartwell said, positioning himself in the space between Cole and Maya in a way that was assertive without being technically aggressive. "Whatever you've been told about Dr. Sinclair, I think you should know she was terminated today for a serious violation of—" "Sir," Cole said, one syllable with enough weight to stop Hartwell mid-sentence. "I don't have time for this conversation. I have a 26-year-old Navy pilot who is going to die without immediate medical intervention. Dr. Sinclair has been identified as the most qualified person within 200 miles for this type of trauma." "Identified by whom?" Cole reached into his jacket and produced a tablet. He held it out briefly long enough for Hartwell to see a military-grade device showing a secured document with an official header, then brought it back. "By the Department of Defense," he said. 3 days ago. Hartwell blinked. Maya kept her face composed, but something shifted behind it. 3 days ago. The mission call had come in today. Calloway's accident had happened this morning. Her name had been in a DOD file 3 days before the pilot went down. 3 days ago, she said. Cole looked at her. Something moved in his eyes, not evasion, but the careful attention of a man who is also sitting with a question about the document he is carrying. "That's correct," he said. The afternoon held still around them for a moment. The parking lot, the assembled onlookers, the helicopter on the roof, all of it paused in the way that significant moments sometimes pause, as though the world needs an extra second to commit to what is about to happen. Hartwell drew himself up. "Commander, I cannot permit Dr. Sinclair to participate in any official capacity. She is no longer affiliated with this institution, and her conduct today represents exactly the kind of—" "I resign," Maya said. Both men looked at her. "My position as a resident at Meridian General. Effective immediately, so there's no question of my status." She was looking at Cole. "Which means I'm not subject to anything this hospital does or doesn't permit." She held his gaze. "Your pilot, how long? 90 minutes, maybe less. Last blood pressure? 70/40. We need to go now." Cole nodded once, already turning. "Follow me." Maya picked up her bag and walked. Behind her, she heard Hartwell say her name not in the authoritative bark of a department chief, but in something smaller and less controlled, almost involuntary, the sound of a man who has just watched something leave the room and understood too late what it meant. She did not turn around. Dana Mercer was standing at the edge of the crowd near the entrance. As Maya passed, she did not stop walking, but she turned her head slightly, and Dana saw something in her face that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not triumph, not vindication. The look of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has in the last 30 seconds put down the part of it that never belonged to her. Dana watched her go. Then she looked at the photograph on her phone. Hartwell in the corridor, the name she had overheard. She pulled up a search browser and typed it in. The first result was a Department of Defense personnel announcement from 3 years prior, a promotion. Colonel Richard Voss promoted to Senior Defense Liaison assigned to the Pentagon. Pictured shaking hands with a general. The second result was from 8 months ago, a board membership announcement from a hospital association. Colonel Richard Voss, retired, appointed to the advisory board of the Southern California Regional Health Consortium. Member institutions were listed in a column on the right side of the page. Meridian General was first on the list. Dana read it twice. She looked up at the rooftop where the helicopter's rotors were already turning. Maya pulled herself into the cabin without waiting for the offered hand of the crew chief, swinging up and in with the practiced ease of someone who has boarded moving vehicles under worse conditions than this one. Cole climbed in behind her and signaled the pilot, and the Seahawk lifted away from Meridian General with the committed motion of an aircraft that has somewhere to be. Below them, the hospital shrank. The parking lot shrank. The small crowd of people who had watched the afternoon with the complicated engagement of witnesses to something they did not entirely understand shrank, and then the building itself, and then the block, until Meridian General was just one white rectangle among many in the grid of San Diego, unremarkable from this height, indistinguishable from any other building, full of ordinary things. Cole raised his voice over the rotor noise. "Dr. Sinclair, your experience with cardiac tamponade, what am I working with?" "I've managed it," she said. "In what context?" "Multiple contexts." She was looking at the water appearing to the south. "I'll need a briefing on his current vitals, any imaging your ship's doctor has obtained, and a full account of what's been attempted." Cole studied her profile for a moment. "Our medical officer is a general practitioner. This is beyond her experience. Portable ultrasound on the ship. Basic. I can work with basic." He opened the tablet. He scrolled, then held the screen toward her. She read the pilot's vitals, the medical officer's notes, the timeline of the accident and the injury classification and the deterioration curve. Her eyes moved quickly and precisely, and her expression stayed steady, and Cole watched all of this with the attentiveness he applied it to assessments. Then she reached the bottom of the document. He watched her stop. Her eyes moved back up the page slightly, then stopped again on a single line. He knew which line. He had read it himself twice and had not been able to account for it. The authorization, the recommendation, the classification of Maya Sinclair as the preferred medical consultant, all dated 3 days ago. Not this morning after Ryan Calloway's aircraft went down. 3 days before any of it had happened. Someone had known. Someone had put her name in a file before the event that would require her name in a file. Cole watched Maya read that line, her face held, but her hand on the edge of the tablet tightened for a moment, 3 seconds no more, and then released, and her expression resettled, and she looked up at him with clear, steady eyes. "This is dated 3 days ago," she said. "Yes." "Lieutenant Calloway's accident was this morning." "Yes." She looked at the document for a moment longer without speaking. "Someone expected this to happen," she said. Cole held her gaze. "That's one interpretation. What's another?" He did not answer immediately. Outside, the water was close, and ahead of them, growing against the horizon, was the long gray shape of the USS Abraham Lincoln. "Dr. Sinclair," Cole said, and his voice had changed not in volume but in character, the way a room changes when someone in it decides to be direct. "Is there anything about your background I should know before we land on that ship?" Maya looked at the carrier, at its flight deck with its organized movement of crew and aircraft, at the island superstructure rising from its center, at the gray certainty of it, the size of it, the way it sat in the water, as though it had always been there and intended to remain. She had not seen a carrier in 4 years. She had intended never to see one again. "Commander," she said, and her voice was even and carried underneath it the sound of a decision that had been building since a parking lot conversation about a name she had not heard in 4 years. "What you should know right now is that your pilot has a window of approximately 45 minutes, and we should be talking about how to use it." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and turned back to the briefing in his hands. The Lincoln grew in the window. Maya Sinclair watched it come. And somewhere beneath the composed surface she had maintained for 14 months and 4 years, and a long time before that, something that had been held under considerable pressure for a very long time began quietly and without announcement to shift. The USS Abraham Lincoln was larger than memory. This was the thing about carriers that civilians never fully grasped, and that even people who had served near them sometimes forgot between encounters the sheer physical fact of the ship. From a distance, it was impressive in the abstract way that large man-made things are impressive. Up close, from a helicopter descending toward its flight deck, it was something else entirely. It was a city on water. It was a small and self-sufficient world that operated by its own rules and its own rhythms and its own understanding of what mattered and what did not. Maya watched the flight deck expand below her as the Seahawk descended, and she watched the organized movement of the crew, the color-coded jerseys, the choreographed patterns, the practiced efficiency of people who worked in conditions where a single misplaced step could be catastrophic, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she did not name and did not examine. She had not been on a carrier in 4 years. She had promised herself she would not be on a carrier again. The helicopter touched down with a clean, certain contact, and the crew chief had the door open before the rotors had fully spooled down, and Maya was already moving, already calculating the distance to the island superstructure and the likely location of the medical bay and the time remaining against what she knew about the deterioration curve of an untreated cardiac tamponade. 45 minutes, maybe less. She swung down from the cabin onto the flight deck, and the wind came off the Pacific with the specific force and smell of open ocean salt and machinery, and something underneath it that was simply the smell of being far from shore. And she kept her head slightly down and moved toward the island with Cole one step behind her. A figure was waiting at the base of the superstructure steps. Chief Petty Officer Grant Holloway was perhaps 50 years old, built like someone who had spent 3 decades doing physical work in difficult conditions and had not softened in the years since. His face was weathered in the way that faces weathered by actual weather are different from faces that have simply aged. He held a clipboard he was not looking at because he was looking at Maya, and the look on his face was a specific thing that Maya identified immediately and filed away and did not react to. It was the look of a man who thinks he recognizes something but is not yet certain enough to speak. "Commander," Holloway said, "medical bay is ready. Dr. Wells has the patient prepped as best she can." "Status," Cole asked. "BP dropped to 65/35 in the last 20 minutes. Pulse is irregular. He's been in and out of consciousness." Cole looked at Maya. Maya was already walking toward the steps. The medical bay of a carrier is not a civilian emergency room. It is not equipped for the same range of procedures, does not have the same depth of imaging capability, does not carry the same volume of specialized supplies. What it has designed into every dimension of it is the specific practicality of a space built for real emergencies in real conditions, staffed by people who understand that help is not coming from somewhere else because this is somewhere else. Maya registered all of this in the 4 seconds it took her to cross the threshold and reach the table where Lieutenant Ryan Calloway lay. He was 26 years old, and he looked younger the way people in serious medical distress sometimes look younger, some quality of the face returning to an earlier arrangement when the body is under enough strain. He was large, the build of an F/A-18 pilot, which required a particular kind of physical conditioning, and he was gray in the way that people become gray when their heart is not moving enough blood efficiently enough, and his breathing was the shallow, labored breathing of someone whose chest is full of something it should not be full of. Dr. Karen Wells was standing at the head of the table. She was perhaps 45 with the competent, worried expression of someone who has correctly diagnosed a problem she is not equipped to solve. "Cardiac tamponade," she said as Maya reached the table. "Blood in the pericardial sac. I've been managing supportively, but he needs a pericardiocentesis and I haven't." "I know," Maya said. She was already running her hands along Calloway's ribcage, feeling the specific landmarks, her fingertips finding what they were looking for, with the assurance of repetition. "What's your ultrasound capability?" "Portable, basic." "Get it on him. Get..." She looked at the IV lines. "What's his access?" "2 large bore peripheral lines, left antecubital, right forearm." "I need a pericardiocentesis kit, a 60cc syringe, a 3-way stopcock, and a 16-gauge needle. I need O-negative blood standing by 2 units minimum." She looked at Wells. "You're going to monitor his vitals and call out any changes in real time. Every change. Don't interpret, just report." Wells nodded, already moving. Cole had positioned himself near the IV lines as he had been asked. Holloway stood at the far side of the bay, arms crossed, watching with the expression he had worn on the flight deck. Still watching, still thinking. Maya positioned herself at the optimal angle to the table, the approach that balanced access to the subcephoid space with visibility of the monitor and the patient's face. She had done this before. She had done this in conditions where the table was a stretcher and the monitor was whatever could be salvaged, and the optimal angle was whatever angle didn't put her in the path of incoming fire. She did not think about any of that. She thought about Ryan Calloway, 26 years old, who had ejected from a failing aircraft over the Pacific Ocean and survived that, and who was not going to survive the next 40 minutes without someone doing what she was about to do. She picked up the needle. "Subcephoid approach," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. 45-degree angle, aim for the left shoulder. I'll advance until I see blood return. Dr. Wells, I need continuous BP readout." 70/40, Wells said. "Pulse 92, irregular." Maya advanced the needle. The room was very still. The carrier moved beneath them with its vast and indifferent steadiness, And outside the medical bay, the flight deck continued its choreography, and none of the people in the bay breathed in quite the way they normally breathed, and the monitor tracked Calloway's struggling heart in green lines across a black screen. 68/38, Wells said, pulse dropping. The needle found what it was looking for. Dark blood filled the syringe, and it was the right color and the right consistency, and Maya began to aspirate with steady, controlled movements that did not rush and did not pause, and the effect was not instant, but it was close. The monitor shifted. The lines changed their character. Calloway's chest expanded slightly with a breath that had more room in it than the one before. BP, coming up, Wells said, and there was something in her voice that was professionally controlled, but contained underneath it a quality that sounded very much like relief. 78/45, pulse stabilizing. Maya continued the procedure, managing the drainage with the systematic patience of someone who understood that speed and control were not opposites, but complements, that the goal was not to be fast, but to be exactly fast enough and no faster. 85/50, Wells said. Pulse 78, regular. Holloway at the far side of the bay uncrossed his arms. Cole let out a breath that he had apparently been holding without realizing it. Wells stared at the monitor with the expression of someone watching a number return from somewhere it should not have gone. Maya finished the drainage, set up the three-way stopcock to manage any reaccumulation, and stepped back exactly far enough to allow Wells to move in and check the patient directly. She stripped one glove. She checked his radial pulse with 2 fingers. He's going to need surgical repair, she said. This bought him time. Balboa has the facilities to handle the underlying injury, but he needs to get there within the next few hours. She looked at Wells. Can you set up continuous drainage monitoring? Yes, Wells said. Absolutely. Check his pupils. I want to rule out any head involvement from the ejection impact. On it. Maya set the used instruments on the tray and stood still for a moment, and the bay reorganized itself around her. Wells moving to Calloway's head, Cole stepping back from the IV lines, the monitor settling into the steadier pattern of a patient who is not for the moment actively dying. It was then that the message appeared on the secondary screen mounted near the bay entrance. It was an internal ship communication text, only the kind that ran through the ship's network and displayed on terminals throughout the vessel. This one was addressed to the medical bay, specifically marked with a routing code that indicated it had come through an external connection, a transmission into the ship's network from outside. The message was 6 words long. Verify consultant identity immediately. Order Colonel R. Voss, Pentagon Liaison. Cole read it. Maya was facing the other direction, making a note on the pad Wells had given her. Cole read it a second time, and then he looked at Maya's back, and his expression did not change in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer. But something in it shifted in the specific way that expressions shift when a person receives a piece of information that reconfigures what they thought they understood about the situation they are in. He did not say anything. He looked at Holloway. Holloway was looking at the screen. He had read it too. Then Holloway looked at Maya, and the expression on his face, which had been a question since the flight deck, became something more certain. Ryan Calloway did not wake up immediately. He came back slowly, the way people come back from the edge of serious medical crisis, moving through stages of consciousness that were not quite sleep and not quite waking. His eyelids flickering, his lips moving around words that didn't quite make it into sound. Wells monitored him continuously. The drainage system held, his vitals tracked in the right direction. Maya stood to one side of the bay and wrote her notes and reviewed the limited imaging Wells had been able to obtain, and thought with the part of her mind that was always thinking several things simultaneously about a 6-word message on a screen behind her. She had not read the message. She had not needed to. She had seen it reflected in the equipment panel surface to her left. The angle had been imperfect. Some of the letters reversed by the reflection, but she had read it in the same way she read other things that were not meant to be seen directly. Voss. She had heard the name in a parking lot in San Diego 2 hours ago from a nurse who had overheard half a phone call. She was hearing it again now on a Navy ship 50 miles offshore in a message that had been routed through a Pentagon connection. The distance between Gerald Hartwell's frightened phone call in a hospital corridor and a Pentagon transmission to a carrier medical bay was not a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. She kept writing her notes. Holloway moved. He came around the far side of the table and positioned himself in the space between Maya and the bay exit, not blocking it exactly, but occupying it in the way that people with a certain kind of training occupy spaces when they want to be present in them deliberately. He was quiet for a moment, watching Wells check Calloway's pupils. Then he said, Firebase Charlie. Maya's pen continued moving. March of 2020, Holloway said. His voice was even and low-calibrated. Not to carry beyond the two of them. A Delta Force attachment took contact near the Firebase perimeter. 3 wounded, 1 critical. The QRF medic was already down. Someone else stepped in. He paused. She worked for 40 minutes under intermittent fire without stopping. When the helicopter finally came in, she was still working. The crew chief said he'd never seen anything like it. He stopped again. They called her Ghost because nobody could figure out where she came from or where she went afterward. Maya set down her pen. She looked at the monitor showing Calloway's vitals. "Chief," she said, "your patient needs—" "I know what my patient needs," Holloway said, not unkindly, "and I know what I'm looking at." The bay was quiet around them. Wells was at the head of the table focused on Calloway, and Cole was near the entrance close enough to hear if he chose to listen, which he was clearly choosing to. Calloway's eyelids moved, opened. He stared at the overhead for a moment with the unfocused look of someone reassembling consciousness from its components. Then his gaze moved traveling the bay in the slow inventory of someone taking stock of their situation, and it stopped when it reached Maya. He looked at her for a long time. His voice when it came was rough and thin, but fully present. "Operation Red Dawn," he said. No one in the bay spoke. September of 2019. Our convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. 3 of my guys went down. The regular medic said he couldn't do anything with what he had. Calloway's eyes had not left Maya. Then there was someone else, a woman. She came in from nowhere and she worked on all 3 of them, and she saved all 3 of them. He stopped to breathe carefully, testing how much the new space in his chest would allow. "I never forgot it. My buddy kept saying a name in recovery, kept saying it over and over like a prayer." He looked at Maya. "Sinclair, that was the name." Cole crossed the bay in 4 steps. He stopped beside Maya and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying a question since he left San Diego and has just been handed its answer without asking for it. "Sergeant Sinclair," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement being tested for confirmation. Maya looked at Calloway, at his gray face and his careful breathing, and the monitor showing his recovering heart. She looked at Holloway, at Wells, at Cole. She had spent 4 years building walls. She had built them carefully and maintained them consistently, and had been, she believed, very good at it. And now in a medical bay on a carrier 50 miles off the California coast, on the same afternoon that Gerald Hartwell had fired her in a parking lot, and Dana Mercer had overheard a frightened phone call, all of those walls were making a sound she recognized. The sound of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time and is about to stop holding. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet and entirely without performance. "My name is Maya Sinclair. I'm a former Delta Force combat medic. 4 deployments between 2017 and 2021. Afghanistan primarily." She looked at Cole directly. "My military records were classified and sealed by executive order in 2021 at the direction of Colonel Richard Voss. Officially, my service record doesn't exist." She paused, which is why it surprised me to hear his name twice today. The bay absorbed this. Holloway, who had spent enough time in the world to know when to be still, was still. Wells, who had spent enough time in hospitals to know when a conversation had moved beyond her clearance level, busied herself with Calloway's chart. Cole looked at Maya steadily. "Why were your records sealed?" This was the question, the real one, the one that everything else had been building toward. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair beside the supply cabinet, because some things should not be said standing up, and she told him. The specific memory that she led with was not the worst one. She had learned over time that the worst ones were not the ones that explained things most clearly. The worst ones were private. The worst ones belonged to her alone, and she intended to keep them. The one she led with was a tent. It was the kind of tent that the Army calls a temper, and it was serving as a medical station in a forward operating base in Kandahar province. And it was September of 2019, and she was 22 years old, and she had been deployed for 8 months, and she had stopped counting the number of times she had been in a space like this because the number had stopped meaning anything. 3 men had been brought in from a vehicle ambush. The regular medic on rotation had assessed the situation and declared 2 of them beyond intervention with the supplies available. He was not wrong exactly in his assessment of the supplies. He was wrong about what could be done with them. Maya had taken over. She had worked for 41 minutes on the 2 men the other medic had classified as non-survivable. She had used what was available and improvised what wasn't, and made decisions that were not in any manual, because the manual had been written by people who had never been in this tent in this night with these specific constraints, and when it was over, both men were breathing. She had done this twice before. She had done it again 4 months later in March of 2020 at Firebase Charlie. That was the one that brought the conversation with Voss. Colonel Richard Voss had commanded the forward operations group she was attached to, and he was by all external measures a capable officer. He had the bearing and the record and the political relationships that senior officers cultivate. He had also the specific relationship with acceptable losses that some people in positions of command develop over time, the calculus that processes human lives through the filter of operational efficiency and produces clean numbers. The third time Maya had disregarded his direct order to withdraw and leave wounded personnel he had called her in. The meeting was not in the FOB command tent where records were kept. It was in a separate space, informal, with no one else present. Voss had explained the situation clearly. Her continued insubordination was creating a problem. Not a moral problem, which was not the currency of this conversation, but an operational one. The field decisions she was overriding were being made by officers with full situational awareness, and her individual judgment, however well-intentioned, could not be permitted to override command authority. She had listened to all of this. Then she had said, "With respect, sir, the 3 men I pulled out last month are alive." And Voss had said, with the measured patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a child, "That's not the point, Sergeant." It was the same sentence Hartwell had used. She had thought about that in the parking lot this afternoon, the same words. The same logic, the same complete confidence that the principle was more important than the outcome. The formal process had begun in February of 2021. It was not the public process. The public process had procedures and advocates and documentation and the possibility of contest. What Voss had initiated was the other kind, the kind that happened in the spaces between official structures where the people with institutional power shaped outcomes before they became matters of record. Maya had been presented with a choice. The choice was this: she could accept an administrative separation under terms that would classify her service record, remove all documentation of the events in question, and allow her to exit with her medical credentials intact. She would sign a non-disclosure agreement of the kind that was technically legal and practically absolute. She would not speak about the events, the orders, the outcomes, or Colonel Richard Voss. Or she could contest the proceedings. The contesting of such proceedings, Voss had explained in a final conversation that had lasted 11 minutes, would require documentation she would not have access to. It would require witnesses who had signed their own agreements. It would take place through channels over which he had significant influence. It would likely result in a general discharge characterization that would compromise her medical license. She was 24 years old. She had signed. She had been out of the service by April of 2021. She had moved to San Diego because it was large enough to disappear into and because it was in the specific geography of her choices, as far as she could reasonably get from the places where the things she could not speak about had happened. 4 years. 14 months at Meridian General. A life assembled from the parts that were still available after the parts that had been taken were subtracted. She had thought she was managing it. She had thought the distance was real. Cole was quiet for a long time after she finished. Holloway had moved at some point during the telling. Maya wasn't certain when to stand near the bay entrance, with his back to the room as though he were simply watching the corridor, which was the specific courtesy of a person who understands that some things should be witnessed without being observed. "Voss," Cole said. "Colonel Richard Voss." "Yes." His name was in that file, the transmission on the screen. "I saw the reflection." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then, "He ordered verification of your identity. That order went through Pentagon channels to this ship." He paused. "He's tracking you." "He's been tracking me," Maya said. "He knew I was at Meridian General. That's why Hartwell was frightened. Hartwell didn't decide to make my career difficult because he had an opinion about protocol. Someone told him to." "You're saying Voss arranged your position there specifically to—" "I'm saying he knew where I was and had someone managing me. Whether he arranged it or simply took advantage of it, I don't know." She looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. "What I know is that today's file had my name in it 3 days before your pilot went down. That's not a coincidence." Cole stood up. He walked to the screen where the message still glowed and read it again. "Who would have put your name in that file 3 days ago?" he said. "Who knew where you were and knew you were the right person for this and had the clearance to put a DOD consultant recommendation in a sealed military document?" Maya shook her head slowly. It was the question she had been sitting with since she had seen the file on the tablet in the helicopter, and she did not have an answer that satisfied her. And the absence of that answer was the part of the afternoon that frightened her most, which was notable given the competition. While Maya Sinclair sat in the medical bay of the USS Abraham Lincoln and told the truth for the first time in 4 years, Gerald Hartwell stood in front of a camera crew from Channel 7 News in the corridor outside his office and said what he had prepared to say. He had composed it quickly in the 20 minutes between Maya's helicopter leaving the rooftop and the news van arriving in the parking lot, and it was a credible performance. He was a good speaker. He had spent 12 years being the person in the room whose voice settled things, and he knew how to arrange words in a sequence that sounded like reason. He said that Maya Sinclair had shown a pattern of disregard for established protocols. He said that the decision to terminate her had been difficult but necessary. He said that the involvement of military personnel was a separate matter that he was not at liberty to comment on. He said that patient safety was always the highest priority at Meridian General, and that enforcing the standards that protected patient safety was not punitive, but responsible. He said all of this in an even authoritative tone. His phone vibrated throughout. He did not look at it during the interview. He looked at the camera with the steady, certain expression of a man who has done the right thing and is comfortable with the record. When the crew left, he walked to the far end of the corridor and stood with his back to the nursing station and answered the call. "She's on the ship," he said. "Cole brought her on board. I don't know what she's told them." The voice on the other end was measured and unhurried, in the way that powerful people's voices that are sometimes unhurried, a quality of patience that comes from experience with situations being managed. "She'll tell them everything eventually," the voice said. "That was always going to happen once she was in a military environment, Bernard. What matters now is the context." A pause. "Is there anything at Meridian General that creates a problem?" Hartwell thought about Dana Mercer in the nursing station and the things that happened in corridors where people thought they were not being observed. "I don't think so," he said. "Gerald, is there anything at Meridian General that creates a problem?" Hartwell was quiet for a moment that was longer than he intended. "There may be some communication records that could be mischaracterized," he said. "Internal emails. Nothing that isn't explainable in context." The silence on the other end of the call had a specific quality. "Handle it," the voice said. "Today." The call ended. Hartwell stood in the corridor for a moment. At the far end of the ward, a door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see the edge of Dana Mercer's uniform as she moved around the nurse's station. He could not tell if she was working or looking at something. He walked back toward his office. Dana watched him go. On the desk in front of her, not visible to anyone approaching from the direction of Hartwell's office, was her personal phone. On the screen was the result of a search she had completed 40 minutes ago, which she had read and reread, and which she was now photographing before she sent it to a number she had looked up in the meantime. The number was for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. She pressed send, then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. The bay was quiet. Calloway had drifted back into a recovery sleep, the deep rebuilding sleep of a body that has been under extreme stress and has just been given a reason to believe the emergency is over. His monitor was steady. Wells sat nearby with her notes glancing at the screen every few minutes with the vigilance of someone who is not going to miss the next change. Cole had been on his radio for the past 10 minutes, standing near the entrance with his back partially to the room. The conversation was inaudible, but its tone was clear, measured, precise, the tone of someone relaying information upward through a chain of command and answering questions about what he had found. Maya sat beside the supply cabinet. She was not thinking about Voss or about Hartwell or about the signed paper she had put her name to in a room in Virginia 4 years ago. She was thinking about a specific moment in a tent in Kandahar province in the 41st minute of a procedure she had performed on a man who was not supposed to be survivable when she had felt him take a breath on his own. She had never told anyone that that was the moment she knew she had made the right choice, that the breath was worth the count, that she would make the same choice again and again and again regardless of the signature on the paper. She had never told anyone because she had not until today told anyone any of it. Holloway came and stood beside her. He did not sit. He stood the way he had stood on the flight deck and in the doorway of the bay, with the patient solidity of a man who has arrived somewhere and intends to remain there for a while. "Firebase Charlie," he said. "I wasn't there that night, but I heard the story from 3 different people afterward on 3 different occasions. That doesn't happen unless something was genuinely remarkable." Maya looked at the monitor. "People tell stories," she said. "They tell some stories more than others." He was quiet for a moment. I've been in the Navy for 28 years. I've known people who were good at their go and people who were exceptional at it. And in my experience, the exceptional ones always end up in some kind of trouble with the people above them. Because exceptional doesn't follow the rules, and the rules are written by people who have never been exceptional. He looked at Calloway's sleeping face. That kid is going to go home to someone who loves him because of what you did in here this afternoon. Maya did not respond. Whatever they did to you in 2021, Holloway said, it was wrong, and I think you know that even if you spent 4 years trying to make peace with it. The ship moved beneath them, steady and enormous, and the Pacific held them up with its vast and indifferent support, and Maya Sinclair sat in the chair beside the supply cabinet and was quiet for long enough that the quality of the silence changed into something that meant something specific. Then she said, I know. 2 words. It was not nothing. Cole finished his radio conversation and turned back into the bay, and his expression had changed in the particular way expressions change when a person has learned something significant and has not yet decided what to do with it. I need to tell you both something, he said. He came to stand in the center of the bay, equidistant from Holloway and Maya, and he spoke in the even direct tone of a briefing. I've been in contact with my command. The message on the screen, the Voss transmission, triggered a review of the authorization chain for this mission. The recommendation that brought Dr. Sinclair onto this ship today came through a specific routing. It was filed by an officer at Balboa Naval Hospital. He paused. It was filed 3 days ago. You told me that, Maya said. I know who filed it, Cole said. That's what I didn't know before. He looked at her. Captain James Whitfield, Commanding Officer, Naval Hospital, Balboa. The name moved through the room. Maya looked at Cole. I don't know that name. He knows yours. Cole pulled out his tablet. He's on approach to this ship right now. ETA 11 minutes. He requested emergency landing authorization 20 minutes ago before I had even finished my radio call. He looked up from the tablet. Before I would have had time to transmit anything about this conversation. The 3 of them processed this. He knew you'd be here, Holloway said. He put me here, Maya said quietly. The bay was very still. And then Cole's radio came back to life, and the voice on it was not his command, and was not Whitfield, and was not the bridge. It was a general ship-wide alert routed through the medical bay terminal, official and terse and absolutely clear. Detain order issued for civilian consultant currently aboard. Authorization Colonel Richard Voss, Pentagon Liaison. Security report to medical bay. Cole read it. Holloway read it. Maya read it in the reflection of the equipment panel the same way she had read the first message, from the same angle with the same composed expression that did not represent the absence of response, but its precise control. He's not waiting for me to come back to shore, she said. No, Cole said. He's doing it here, on a Navy ship. Which means he's not worried about the Navy, Holloway said. Which means he has enough reach inside the structure that he believes this will be processed and executed without significant pushback. The footsteps in the corridor outside the bay were already audible. 2 sets, moving with purpose. Cole looked at the door, then at Maya, then at the door again. He made a decision that was visible on his face only in retrospect, only after the decision had been made, and its consequences were already in motion. He stepped to the center of the bay entrance, and when the security personnel appeared in the doorway, he held up a hand. Stand by, he said in the voice he used when he meant it, absolutely. We have a critical patient in active recovery. Nobody comes in until I say so. The 2 security personnel, both younger than Cole and both sufficiently junior to find the command of a Navy commander, a compelling reason to pause, stopped. Cole turned back to the bay. And behind him through the secondary entrance, the equipment access door on the far side of the bay that connected to the ship's service corridor, the door opened. The man who came through it was perhaps 55 years old, silver-haired in the dress uniform of a Navy captain, and he moved with the bearing of someone who has been in enough serious situations to distinguish between the ones that require dignity and the ones that require speed. He was currently moving at speed. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at Maya. Dr. Sinclair, he said, I'm Captain James Whitfield, Naval Hospital, Balboa. He was breathing slightly harder than his bearings suggested he wanted to. I came through the service corridor because I needed 30 seconds before the people in that doorway see me. He looked at Cole. Commander, I'm sorry for the lack of notice. This situation moved faster than I anticipated. You filed the consultation recommendation 3 days ago, Maya said. Yes? Before the accident? Yes. He held her gaze without flinching. I've been building a case against Colonel Richard Voss for 2 years. Documenting the incidents in Afghanistan, tracking the administrative actions he took to protect himself, looking for people with direct knowledge of what happened who were still in positions to speak about it. He stopped. The problem was the agreement you signed. It's legally enforceable in a civilian context. In a military context with the right proceedings initiated through the right channels, it's a different situation. He paused. I needed a witness, not just any witness, someone with direct first-hand experience of the specific incidents, someone whose account would be contemporaneous, incredible, and corroborated by the outcomes. You needed me, Maya said. I needed you in a public enough situation that Voss couldn't quietly make it disappear. A civilian consultation for a military emergency documented on a carrier with multiple witnesses across 2 commands. He looked at Calloway on the table. He's going to be all right. Yeah, Wells said from the far side of the bay. It was the first word she had spoken in a long time. Whitfield nodded. I'm sorry for the method. I am aware that I placed you in a situation without your knowledge or consent, and I am aware of how that sits against the principles I'm claiming to be acting in service of. Maya looked at him for a long moment. There was a sound from the doorway. Cole was still holding the security personnel in the corridor with his presence and his rank, but that arrangement had a finite duration. Voss has just issued a detain order, Maya said. On this ship. I know, I saw it on the terminal in the approach corridor. Whitfield's expression was steady, which means we have a very short window before this becomes a different kind of situation. What do you need from me? Right now, just your presence. Your documented, witnessed, officially recorded presence on this ship in this context associated with this mission. Everything else comes later in the right form. And later, what does later require? Whitfield was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, not hesitating, considering. Testimony, he said, in the right proceedings with the right protections in place, which I can arrange. An account of what you experienced, what you witnessed, what you were ordered to do, and what you chose to do instead. He paused. And the outcomes of those choices. 3 men at Kandahar, 2 at Firebase Charlie, all of them provably alive because you made the decision you made. Maya was quiet. The footsteps in the corridor had shifted. A third set now, someone senior to judge by the pace. If you testify, she said, what happens to the agreement I signed? In the proceedings, I'm describing the agreement is superseded by a higher obligation. Military law has specific provisions for exactly this situation. He met her eyes directly. It was never a legitimate agreement. It was coercion with a signature on it. That's not the same thing. The secondary door, through which Whitfield had entered, was still slightly ajar, and through it came the ambient sound of the ship, the distant machinery and movement of a vessel carrying its world on the ocean, and underneath it, the specific silence of a decision being made. Maya Sinclair sat in the chair beside the supply cabinet and looked at Captain James Whitfield and thought about a tent in Kandahar province, and a man taking a breath he was not supposed to be able to take, and about 4 years of building walls and the sound those walls were making. She thought about Arthur Hendricks in room 307, who had left 2 men behind in a desert in 1991 and carried that for 34 years, and who had looked at her and said, don't let them make you carry what they should be carrying. The footsteps in the main corridor stopped outside the bay entrance. Cole's voice from the doorway. One moment. The moment held. And Maya Sinclair, who had spent 4 years becoming someone smaller than herself, looked at the man who had been looking for her for 2 years and made the calculation that she should have made a long time ago. Tell me, she said, what the proceedings require, all of it. And tell me how long we have before that corridor becomes a problem we can't manage. Whitfield crossed the bay. He sat down. He began to talk. The helicopter came in from the south, and the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does over San Diego in October, laying itself across the city in long, warm angles that made everything look like the last frame of something, like the moment just before a story decides what it is going to be. Maya sat in the cabin and watched the coast approach and said nothing. Whitfield sat across from her. Cole was beside the pilot. In the hold behind them, a second aircraft carried Ryan Calloway stable and monitored and alive en route to Balboa Naval Hospital for the surgical repair that would complete what she had started in the medical bay. The 2 aircraft flew in loose formation, and Maya watched the second one through the window with the specific attention she gave to things that mattered and that she could not directly control. The detain order had been withdrawn. This had taken 9 minutes, during which Whitfield had made 2 calls and Cole had made 1, and the security personnel in the corridor outside the medical bay had stood with the patience of people trained to wait and the discomfort of people caught between competing authorities. The withdrawal had come through official channels logged and time-stamped, which meant it existed in a record that could not be quietly removed. Whitfield had explained this in the calm, precise tone of someone who had anticipated this sequence and had prepared for it the way a surgeon prepares for a procedure, not with certainty that nothing would go wrong, but with enough planning that the things that went wrong would be manageable. Voss had overreached. In issuing the detain order through official Pentagon channels, rather than through the informal structures he typically used, he had created documentation. The documentation connected his name to Maya's in a way that was now part of the ship's official record, and the ship's official record was not within his power to alter. Whitfield had explained this without appearing to take satisfaction in it, which was the mark of a man who had spent long enough in difficult situations to know that satisfaction was premature until the situation was fully resolved. Maya had listened to all of it and had asked 2 questions and had been quiet for the rest of the time on the ship. The first question was, what happens to the men whose testimony supports the case against Voss? The answer was that their records would be reviewed and the administrative actions taken against them revisited, and several of them would receive the recognition that had been withheld. This was not a guarantee. It was a reasonable expectation based on precedent, and it was the honest version of the answer, rather than the reassuring version, which was why she had believed it. The second question was, what happens to me when this is over? Whitfield had looked at her for a moment before answering, and in that moment, she had understood that the answer was going to be honest too, which she respected. He said, you become visible, not in the way you were before, not in the way that created the vulnerability Voss exploited, but visible in the way that public record creates. Your service, your actions, your outcomes, all of it becomes part of the documented world rather than the unofficial one. He said some people will find that a relief. Some people will find it difficult. Most people find it both. She had looked out the window at the Pacific and said, in the non-disclosure agreement, he had said it was never legal in the way it was represented to you. The right proceedings will establish that clearly, but you should know that establishing it clearly will require you to say in a recorded form what it was in exchange for, what was threatened and what was offered. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, I understand, and she had meant it, which was the beginning of something she had not had in 4 years. The Meridian General rooftop was visible before the hospital itself was, which was the geometry of helicopters, and as the building resolved from the city grid into a specific structure with a specific shape, Maya saw the gathering below it. The news vans were easy to identify, 2 of them angled for position in the parking lot. The crowd was harder to parse from height, but clearly larger than what the end of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon would produce. She could see the bright clothing of people who were not hospital staff, which meant family members, which meant the story had traveled. Cole turned from the front of the aircraft. Prepared for this? No, Maya said. It was the honest answer, and she had decided sometime in the last 2 hours that she was done with answers that were anything other than honest. Neither am I, Cole said, for what that's worth. It was worth something. The helicopter touched down on the rooftop with the same clean precision it had left, with which felt significant in a way that was not entirely rational and was therefore entirely human. Maya climbed down without waiting and stood for a moment with the rotor wash moving around her, looking at the door that led to the stairwell, which led to the floors below, which led to the people waiting in the parking lot and the lobby and the corridors of a hospital where she had worked for 14 months and where 2 hours ago she had been publicly dismissed as a dangerous liability. She walked through the door. Whitfield came behind her, Cole behind him. The stairwell was cool and smelled of the specific combination of disinfectant and ventilation that was the constant ambient scent of every hospital she had ever been in, civilian or military. She descended 2 flights and pushed through the door into the 4th floor corridor, and the first person she saw was Dana Mercer. Dana was standing at the junction of the main corridor and the elevator bank with the alert position quality of someone who has been waiting and is ready. She was holding her phone in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other, and when she saw Maya, something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite triumph and was entirely authentic. She fell into step beside Maya without being invited, which was the arrangement they had. Hartwell is in the main conference room, Dana said low and steady. The board called him in an hour ago. There are people waiting to speak with you, families of patients, some of the staff. Channel 7 wants a statement. I told them you'd determine that. Thank you. There's something else. Dana held out the folded paper. I pulled these from the hospital's internal server before Hartwell could do anything about them. He tried to access the archive function about 40 minutes ago. I think he was going to delete some records. She paused. I flagged the attempt. The records are secure. Maya took the paper. She unfolded it as she walked. It was a printed chain of internal emails. The header on the first one was dated 4 years ago, 3 weeks before Maya's first day at Meridian General. The sender was an external address, the domain of which she did not immediately recognize. The recipient was Gerald Hartwell. She read the first 2 lines of the first email. She kept walking, but something shifted in the specific way things shift when a suspicion is confirmed and you realize you had on some level already known. The email used careful language. Bureaucratic language, the kind that is crafted to be technically deniable. But its meaning when you had the context to read it was clear. It was an instruction. It described a specific individual who would be joining the residency program. It outlined a set of professional circumstances that should be cultivated. It did not use the word suppress, but it used words that added up to the same instruction. The sender's name was not in the email, but the sign-off was an initial only, and it was the first letter of the name she had heard twice today. Whitfield, walking beside her, leaned slightly to read the paper. He straightened without speaking, but his jaw had set in the way that jaws set when a person has been shown the document they needed, and the sight of it is both vindicating and enraging. "How many emails?" he asked Dana. 14 over 4 years, Dana said. The most recent one is from 6 weeks ago. Right after Maya performed a procedure in the ER that 3 attendings called exceptional. She paused. Hartwell's response to that one reads, "Still managing contained." The corridor was quiet around them. They had come out on a floor where the nursing staff had clustered at the station in the way that people cluster when they want to witness something without appearing to have sought it out. Several of them looked at Maya with expressions that ranged from complicated to simple, and the simple ones were the ones that looked like apology. Maya looked back at all of them without changing her expression, and she kept walking. The main conference room was on the 3rd floor, and by the time Maya reached it, it had become something that was no longer quite a conference room. The long table had been pushed to one side. Chairs had been arranged in a configuration that suggested a meeting rather than a briefing, people facing people rather than people facing a presentation. The board members were there, 6 of them, in the specific posture of people who have been doing institutional damage control for an hour and are tired. 3 attorneys occupied a cluster of chairs near the window. Several senior physicians sat along one wall. Hartwell stood at the far end of the room. He was still in his white coat, which was the choice of a man who needed the armor of his role, and he was standing with his hands at his sides and his chin up, which was the posture he defaulted to when he needed to project a confidence he was not entirely feeling. Maya had seen the posture before in this building many times, and it had always worked on her in the way that authority works on people who have been conditioned to accommodate it. It did not work on her now. She came through the door and stopped, and Whitfield and Cole came in behind her, and the room adjusted itself to their presence the way rooms do. The door on the far side of the room, the one that connected to the accessible entrance from the East Wing corridor, opened. The wheelchair came through first. Arthur Hendricks was upright in it, which was not the posture of a man who had been in surgery 12 hours ago, and which said everything necessary about the kind of man he was. He was wearing his hospital gown, which had been supplemented by a flannel shirt that his son had apparently brought in a detail that said someone who loved him had been here all day. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was the face of a man who has seen enough of the world to have arrived at a place beyond performance. On his chest, pinned to the flannel shirt, was the Bronze Star. His son Daniel pushed the wheelchair to a position that was neither peripheral nor central, the position of someone who has determined exactly where he needs to be to say what he has come to say. Arthur looked at Hartwell first. Then he looked at Maya. Then he looked at the room in general with the level, unhurried gaze of a man addressing a formation. "I understand," he said, "that there's been some discussion today about what constitutes proper procedure." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I was in the Gulf in 1991. I was 39 years old, which is old for the field, and I knew it, and I went anyway because the Army needed experienced NCOs, and I was one." He paused. "We took fire outside Kuwait City. My convoy. 3 men went down. Our medic did what he could, which was not enough. Command issued the order to pull back." The room was completely silent. "I followed the order," Arthur said. "I followed procedure. I did what I was told by the people above me who had the authority to tell me what to do." He stopped. His hands folded in his lap tightened slightly. "I left 2 men behind. They were still alive when we pulled out. I have thought about that decision every day for 34 years. He looked at Hartwell directly. "You stood in a parking lot this afternoon and told people that the woman who saved my life was dangerous, that she had no regard for proper procedure." He paused. I want you to understand something, Dr. Hartwell. Procedure is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used well or used badly. Today, in this hospital, procedure was used badly. And the person who used it badly was not the woman you fired. Hartwell's face had gone through several stages in the time Arthur had been speaking. The initial arrangement of professional composure had given way to something more complicated, and that had given way to something that was underneath everything else, a simpler and more human thing. It looked from where Maya stood like shame. "Son," Arthur said to Daniel without turning his head, "the paper." Daniel produced an envelope from his jacket and brought it to the center of the table and laid it down. He did not explain what it was. He went back to his position behind his father's wheelchair. "My father wants me to tell you," Daniel said, addressing the board members, that is a formal complaint co-signed by 11 members of the Desert Storm Veterans Association chapter here in San Diego. It outlines what happened in this building today and requests a formal review of Dr. Sinclair's termination and the circumstances surrounding it. He paused. "My father also wants me to tell you that if the review is not initiated within 72 hours, the complaint will be filed simultaneously with the State Medical Board and the Veterans Affairs Office." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Hendricks, we appreciate—" "I'm not finished," Arthur said quietly. The board member stopped. Arthur looked at Maya. "Don't let them make you carry what they should be carrying," he said. "I told you that last night and I meant it. Some of what happened to you, you're going to carry regardless. That's the nature of service. But the part they put on you on purpose, the paperwork and the silence, and the 4 years of making yourself smaller, that's theirs. Make sure it goes back to the people it belongs to." Maya looked at him. She had been in this building for 14 months and had managed with considerable effort to keep the things she felt contained within the professional surfaces she presented. She was aware, standing in this conference room, that the management was becoming more difficult, and she did not fight it as hard as she might have. "Yes, sir," she said, quietly, with the specific inflection of military address, the first time she had used it in 4 years. Arthur nodded once, the nod of a man who has said what he came to say and is satisfied with the record. Then he looked at Hartwell again. Hartwell was looking at the bronze star on the old man's chest. Something in Gerald Hartwell's face broke in the way that things break that have been held under pressure for longer than they were designed to hold. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet internal collapse of a man who has been telling himself a story about what he was doing and why, and has just had that story taken away from him by a 74-year-old veteran in a hospital gown and a flannel shirt. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at Maya, and the expression on his face in that moment was one she did not have a ready category for, not guilt exactly and not apology exactly, but something that lived in the territory between them and was perhaps more honest than either. "I have been practicing medicine for 30 years, Hartwell said. His voice was quiet. It had lost the carrying quality entirely. "I believed for most of those 30 years that the protocols I enforced were the expression of what this hospital stood for. That rigor and discipline were the same thing as excellence." He stopped. He started again. "I have known for several years that certain communications I was receiving from outside this institution were that the relationship was irregular. I told myself the irregularity was manageable, that it served a legitimate institutional purpose." He looked at Maya. "I told myself that a great many times." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He set it on the table. "That is my resignation," he said, "effective immediately. I have already tendered it to the board chair. I am told this will not resolve all of the questions about my conduct, and I am told correctly." He stepped back. "I am also told that the board is prepared to begin the process of reinstating Dr. Sinclair's position. What position she might accept is, appropriately, her decision." He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "I spent 30 years believing that following protocol was the same as doing good," he said, and it was said to the room and to no one in particular, and perhaps most of all to himself. "Today I learned that protocol can be a weapon. I used it as one. There is not a version of this afternoon in which that is acceptable." He paused. "I'm sorry, Dr. Sinclair. It is insufficient. I'm aware of that." He walked out. The door closed behind him. The room was quiet for a long time. It was Cole who spoke first in the measured, practical tone of someone moving a necessary process forward. "Captain Whitfield has materials that will need to be reviewed by appropriate legal counsel. I'd recommend that begin today." He looked at the board members. Dr. Sinclair's involvement in the proceedings that follow will require the hospital's formal cooperation, including documentation of her employment history and performance record, which by all accounts is exceptional. He let that land for a moment. The Navy is prepared to be a cooperative partner in this process. In return, we'd ask for the same. The board chair, a woman of approximately 60 who had been listening to the afternoon's events with the careful attention of someone assembling a full picture, before speaking, looked at Maya. Dr. Sinclair, she said, the board would like to discuss your future with this institution at your convenience. We understand if today is not that day. It isn't, Maya said. Of course, when you're ready. Maya looked at Arthur Hendricks, who had been sitting through the last several minutes with the patient stillness of a man who has made his contribution and is content to let the proceedings continue. He caught her eye and gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of a man who considers the business concluded. She gave him the same nod back. The hallway outside of the conference room was busy in the controlled way of a hospital that has not stopped running because of the drama occurring in its administrative wing. Patients still needed attending. Tests still needed reading. The fundamental work of the place continued in its necessary rhythms, indifferent to the afternoon's events, which was either comforting or indifferent depending on how you looked at it. Dana Mercer was waiting in the hallway with two other nurses and a physician's assistant, who Maya recognized as having been a quiet presence of support throughout her residency. They were standing in a loose group with the specific quality of people who have agreed on something and are waiting for the right moment to say it. Dana held out a sheet of paper. It was a petition. The heading read, Formal Proposal Designation of Emergency Intervention Standard. Below the heading were the undersigned members of the clinical staff of Meridian General Hospital hereby propose that the Emergency Cardiac Intervention Protocol successfully employed in Operating Room 3 on the afternoon of October 14th be formally documented and designated as the Sinclair Protocol in recognition of the skill judgment and patient advocacy demonstrated by Dr. Maya Sinclair. There were 41 signatures. The last one, added in a slightly unsteady but entirely legible hand at the bottom of the page, read, Arthur W. Hendricks, Patient Room 307. Maya looked at the paper for a long moment. She thought about saying that it was unnecessary. She thought about saying that any trained trauma specialist with the right experience would have done the same thing. She thought about the various forms of deflection she had practiced over 4 years of making herself smaller, and she set them aside one by one like instruments returned to a tray after a procedure is complete. Thank you, she said, and she meant it without qualification. Dana nodded, the nurses nodded. The physician's assistant said something quiet and genuine that Maya would remember later without being able to quote precisely which was the nature of the things that mattered most in the moment they were said. She kept walking. Ryan Calloway was being prepared for transport to Balboa in the hospital's ground floor bay when Maya came through. He had been moved from the Navy helicopter by stretcher, and a Balboa surgical team had arrived by van and was now managing the transfer with the efficiency of people who have been briefed and know what they are dealing with. His color was better. His eyes were open. When Maya came through the bay door, they found her immediately. Dr. Sinclair, he said. His voice was thin but steady. She came to the side of the stretcher. The surgical team moved with the practiced courtesy of people giving a specific moment its necessary space. How are you feeling? She asked. Like I ejected from a supersonic aircraft into the ocean, he said, which is accurate. He looked at her directly. They told me what you did on the Lincoln. Dr. Wells did the monitoring. Chief Holloway managed the medications. That's not what I meant. He was quiet for a moment. My mother sent a letter through the Red Cross after Kandahar to the medic named Sinclair who saved the guys from my squadron. She never got a response. Maya was still. Did she get a response? He asked, not pressing, just asking. The mail system in forward operating areas is, she stopped, started again. Yes, I got a lot of letters. From families. I read all of them. She paused. I didn't respond to most of them because the situation I was in made correspondence complicated, but I read them. She looked at him. They mattered more than you could know. Calloway nodded slowly. Something in his face settled into a quieter arrangement. Tell her that, he said, if there's ever a way to tell her that. There might be, Maya said. Things are changing. The surgical team moved back in with gentle efficiency, and the stretcher began its transit toward the transport vehicle, and Maya stepped back and watched Calloway go. She watched until the bay doors closed and the sound of the vehicle carrying him faded, and then she stood in the empty bay for a moment, in the particular stillness that follows the passing of something significant. She became aware that Cole had come in behind her. He was standing at a respectful distance, which she appreciated, and he was quiet, which she appreciated more. After a moment, she turned around. Captain Whitfield's offer, she said, the position at Balboa, the testimony, and the proceedings. She looked at Cole. What's your assessment of the realistic timeline? The proceedings will take time. Months, probably. Voss has resources, and he'll use them. Cole paused. But the documentation Whitfield has combined with the ship's record of today, combined with whatever Dana Mercer sends to NCCIS, and yes, I know she sent something. I know the look of someone who has just reported something. The evidentiary picture is substantial. He met her eyes. I think it's enough. I think it was enough before today. Today made it undeniable. And the position, the military-civilian medical bridge initiative is real. It's been in proposal stage for 18 months. It needs someone who understands both sides of the line from lived experience, not theoretical familiarity. He paused. It would be based at Balboa. You'd work with veterans transitioning their medical skills to civilian careers. You'd consult on trauma cases requiring your specific level of expertise. You'd help build training protocols that reflect what combat medicine actually involves rather than what people imagine it involves. Maya thought about the nurses she had worked beside for 14 months who had never been told why her hands moved the way they moved. She thought about the residents who would come after her trained in civilian hospitals that did not know how to receive the knowledge that came back from combat zones. She thought about the medics who were somewhere right now in forward positions, whose names were not yet public, doing what she had done, making the decisions she had made, and who would come home eventually to a system that did not have a language for what they had learned. It's a real problem, she said. Yes, Cole said. It's a real problem that needs a real person to work on it. She looked at the closed bay door. I need some time, she said. Not to decide. I've decided. I need some time to stand in a place I know and breathe before the next thing begins. Of course, Cole said. Take whatever you need. She walked toward the stairwell. The roof of Meridian General was not a beautiful place in the conventional sense. It was a functional rooftop marked with the yellow lines of the helipad and the mechanical housings of the HVA2 systems and the safety railings required by code. The afternoon light was nearly gone, the last of it sitting on the horizon to the west in the way that California light departs. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a gradual golden insistence, as though it wants to be sure you've seen it before it goes. The Pacific was visible from the western edge between buildings, a narrow and certain stripe of blue going to gray. Maya stood at that edge and looked at it. The city spread below her in its ordinary vastness, its ordinary grid of streets and lights beginning to come on as the afternoon conceded to evening, its ordinary movement of cars and people going to the ordinary destinations of an ordinary evening in a city of 1 million people who had lived their Tuesday without any awareness of the afternoon that had occurred on this rooftop and on a ship 50 miles offshore and in an operating room on the 3rd floor of this building. Ordinary. The word had carried for 4 years a quality of aspiration. She had wanted ordinary. She had built a life around ordinary, had practiced being a person for whom ordinary was sufficient, had worked with considerable diligence at not being the person she actually was. She had not been very good at it. She knew that now in the way that you sometimes know things retroactively, not the fact of them, which you may have always suspected, but the full weight of them, which requires the right moment to arrive. She was not an ordinary person. She had never been going to be an ordinary person. The skills she had, the way she moved through a crisis, the specific quality of her focus under pressure, these things were not coincidental, and they were not separable from the experiences that had formed them, and the experiences that had formed them were not something she could leave on a shelf and come back to find unchanged. You carry what you are. Arthur Hendricks had been right in the specific way that people who have lived long enough to stop pretending are sometimes right. Some of what she would carry was hers to carry. The weight of the decisions, the faces of the people, the tent in Kandahar province, and the minute-by-minute reckoning of a life lived in the space between what was ordered and what was right. That weight did not belong to anyone else. She was not interested in putting it down. But the other weight, the 4 years of diminishment, the signature on the paper and the changed posture and the marker over her own face in her own reconstruction of her own memory, that belonged to Voss. That was not her weight, and she was going to put it down, and she was going to watch the proceedings that placed it back where it belonged. The door to the stairwell opened. Cole came through it, which she had expected. He came to stand beside her at the railing with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the horizon, which was the appropriate posture for this kind of conversation, present, but not intrusive company without demand. They stood in silence for a while. I was 19 years old, Maya said. Her voice was quiet and entirely level. When I enlisted, basic training at Fort Jackson. The first week, our primary instructor asked each of us why we had chosen to go into medicine. Some people said because of a family member who'd been sick. Some said because they'd watched a documentary. One kid said because it was the fastest path to a non-combat posting. She paused. He asked me last. Cole waited. I said because someone has to stay when everyone else runs. The horizon held the last of the light. My instructor looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then he wrote something in his notebook and moved on. She paused. I never knew what he wrote, but I thought about it for years, whether it was the right answer or the naive answer, whether it was something I actually believed or something I said because I was 19 years old and had not yet been in the situations that would test it. And now, Cole asked. She was quiet for a moment. Now I know it was both, she said. Naive and real at the same time, the way things are when you're 19 and you've arrived at the right belief for the wrong reasons. The reasons get better later. But the belief stays. Cole nodded slowly. The city below them continued its evening in its ordinary way. What are you going to do? He asked. Maya looked at the stripe of ocean visible between the buildings, at the carrier invisible at this distance, but present in her mind with the clarity of something recently experienced. At the city around her, civilian and complex, and full of people for whom the line between military medicine and civilian medicine was an abstraction if they thought about it at all. Build the bridges, she said, and make sure no one else has to choose between the two sides of it. She paused. There are people coming home right now from places whose names will be in the news in 6 months. They have knowledge that this system doesn't know how to receive. They have skills that hospitals like this one would benefit from and can't recognize. They are going to spend years becoming smaller versions of themselves because there is no structure to tell them that what they learned is valuable here. She turned to look at Cole directly. That is a solvable problem. It requires someone who has been on both sides of it to build the solution. I've been on both sides of it. Yes, Cole said. You have. Tell Whitfield I accept. Not because I want the rank or the title, because the work is real and I know how to do it and it needs to be done. She looked back at the horizon. And because Arthur Hendricks was right that some weight goes back to the people it belongs to, but he was also right that service doesn't end, it just changes form. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll tell him. He turned and went back to the stairwell door. He stopped with his hand on it. For what it's worth, Sergeant, he said, using the rank for the second time that day, what you did on that ship today, I've been in the Navy for 17 years. I've seen people work under pressure. I've never seen anything like it. Maya looked at the ocean. Tell that to the people who trained me, she said. Most of them never got the credit either. Cole went through the door. She stood alone on the roof as the last of the light left the sky and the city settled into its evening certainty, and she let herself remember a particular moment in a medical tent in Kandahar province in September of 2019. A man who was not supposed to survive, the moment his chest expanded with a breath he had taken on his own. The specific quality of that breath, not dramatic, not loud, just a breath, just the body's insistence on continuing, and the feeling that had come with it, which she had spent 4 years trying to describe accurately to herself and had never fully managed. It was not triumph. It was not relief exactly, though it contained relief. It was the feeling of having been exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do at the exact moment that it mattered. That feeling had not come from the training manual. It had not come from the protocol. It had come from the decision made under fire to stay. She had made the right decision that night. She had made it again today in an operating room at 2:47 in the afternoon, and in a parking lot, and in a medical bay on the Pacific Ocean, and in a conference room with a bronze star and a flannel shirt in her eyeline. She would keep making it. That was who she was. That had always been who she was. She straightened her shoulders once in the way she had learned to stand and had never entirely forgotten, and she looked at the ocean for one more moment, and then she turned and walked back to the door. 18 months later, a room in Naval Hospital Balboa was full of people who had come from places most of them preferred not to name specifically in public. They were men and women who had served in roles that did not appear on standard military career tracks and who had brought home skills that did not appear in standard civilian medical credentials and who had spent varying amounts of time trying to translate what they knew into a language that civilian institutions could receive. Some of them had been successful at this translation. Most of them had not. The program they were entering had been designed by someone who understood both languages because she had lived in both of them, and it had been designed with a specific understanding that translation was not enough. That what was needed was not a phrase book, but a bridge, a structure that allowed knowledge to pass in both directions without requiring either side to pretend the other did not exist. At the front of the room, Maya Sinclair stood in the dress uniform of a Navy Reserve lieutenant commander and looked at the people in the chairs in front of her. Some of them she knew by reputation. Some of them she knew by more direct means. All of them had the specific quality of people who have been somewhere and done something and come back to a world that was not entirely sure what to do with them. She knew that quality well. In the first row, wearing civilian clothes and the measured expression of a man who has spent his adult life understanding exactly where he is at any given moment, Arthur Hendricks sat with his hands folded in his lap. He was not there as a patient. He was there as a witness, officially as an invited guest at the program's inaugural session, unofficially as the embodiment of the reason the program existed. He had been asked by 3 separate news outlets over the preceding 18 months to describe what had happened in the parking lot of Meridian General on an October afternoon. He had declined each time politely and finally. He had said some things speak for themselves. Colonel Richard Voss had resigned his Pentagon position 6 months prior, 2 weeks before the proceedings against him reached their formal conclusion. The proceedings had concluded. The record had been adjusted in the careful bureaucratic way that official records are adjusted to reflect a more complete account of the events in Afghanistan. Several other service members had received recognition that had been withheld. The non-disclosure agreements that had been signed in small rooms with no witnesses had been examined in the light of day and found to be what they had always been. Gerald Hartwell had not practiced medicine since the October afternoon of his resignation. Dana Mercer had been promoted to charge nurse, which was a title that had been available for years and which she had been effectively performing without formal recognition for most of that time. Elliot Graves, the second-year resident who had raised his hand in a parking lot and asked a question he knew would cost him something, had received his senior residency placement at the institution of his first choice. Maya had written his recommendation. The letter had not been long, but it had said what it needed to say about the specific quality of courage that presents itself as a question in a moment when questions have consequences. Maya looked at the room of people in front of her. She thought about what to say. She had prepared remarks. They were good remarks, considered and practical, and appropriately oriented toward the work ahead. She would say them, but first she said something else. "Some of you have been carrying knowledge that no one here has asked you for yet," she said. "You've been managing it, containing it, finding ways to practice what you know without being asked to explain where it came from." She paused. "That ends today. This is a room where what you know is the point, where the skills you developed in the most difficult conditions of your lives are not a complication to be managed, but a resource to be used." The room was very still. "You are going to save lives in this building," she said. "Not because of your titles and not because of your credentials, though those matter too, because of what you learned in the places no one talks about at medical conferences, because of what you can do when the equipment is wrong and the conditions are impossible and the protocol doesn't have a page for the situation you're in." She looked at Arthur Hendricks in the front row, and something passed between them that was not a smile but was warmer than neutrality.